back for part 2 of the dispositions class. In the first part of this course, we went through and we discussed assignments of contract, essentially what they were, double closes. We talked about the benefits of assignments versus double closes. We also talked about taking the property down to secure the transaction and why that might benefit you. We talked about building a buyer's list, how to build 100 new buyers a week. We also talked about marketing the property for sale. And I believe we ended on marketing to owner-occupied buyers for the sale of your discounted property. So that's where we covered in part 1. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, make sure to go back and watch that one again. And in this slide, or in this course, we're going to continue moving forward in the disposition side, actually going through and doing the showings, going through and qualifying the buyer, assigning and or double closing with the buyer, and some of the paperwork that you're going to need to put in place to make sure that you stay secured in this transaction. Okay, so moving forward, co-wholesaling. We've talked about acquisitions, and now we're going into dispositions. If you are struggling to get your property sold on your own, or another real estate investor / wholesaler approaches you and says, hey, I have a solid buyer in line, would you be interested in splitting this deal if I'm able to bring you a buyer? That is going to be what we're going to call co-wholesaling. That means you're working with another investor to get this deal done and you split up the profits. Now, there's a few ways to look at this. If you feel solid about your ability to get it sold, then you really don't need the co-wholesaler involved with you. But if you do find a position where you're struggling to get this deal sold, you might want to shop around to 2 or 3 established wholesalers that you can work directly with and find an opportunity to allow them to market your contract and see if they can get it sold on your behalf, and then you split up the funds however you might see. This is a legitimate exit strategy for those of you that don't have a solid buyer's list in place. Now, what I don't want to see happen, and what I don't want you to get the impression that I'm referring to, is what I'm going to call daisy chaining. Daisy chaining is what, and it's going to be used loosely. The terms don't have an exact definition to them, but what I call daisy chaining is when someone sees that you're marketing a property and they remarket your property without your permission. Essentially, they are going out there marketing your contracts, and they're trying to mark your contracts up to see if they can find a buyer to bite and then approach you to contract it. I don't consider that to be right. That's what I'm going to call daisy chaining. But co-wholesaling is what I'm going to say is that if somebody approaches you and says, hey, you have a deal, do you mind if I market it? Let's put together some form of agreement so that way I have the rights to market your contract, and then y'all split up the profits however y'all find is advantageous to both of you. Co-wholesaling, another solid exit strategy for getting out from under one of those deals. And I'll have a whole class just on co-wholesaling towards the end of this series that we've put together here. Something else to look at. Now that I've gone through, I've marketed, I've put it out on Facebook groups, email blasts, text messages, I've called up all the landlords around me, I've done everything I can do to get this property with some eyeballs on it. Now I need to prepare for showings. Showings. What do I mean by showings? These people that are wanting to buy it are going to need to tour the property. And there's going to be a few key things that you're going to need to take into consideration when doing this. Is the property owner occupied? If the property is owner occupied, if you set the stage correctly like I told you to, and disclose what your intent was to market the property for sale in regards to getting the assignment of contract knocked down or double close, whichever way you go through on that. If I've prepped the seller adequately, then that seller should be well aware of what I'm about to do. And I'll just tell that owner-occupied or owner-occupant and say, hey, I intend on coming by the property on Tuesday at 11 a.m. To show the property to my potential partners. Can I go ahead and put a lockbox on the property so that I may enter on the 11th? Most homeowners I have dealt with did not have an issue with that. There have been a few that are like, no, that's my house, I'd prefer to be there. That's fine. Why? Because the seller is very much aware of what I'm doing. I've disclosed to them that I intend to wholesale the contract. Okay, so I'll do that, and I'll just make sure that all my buyers are aware that the seller will be on property and that they are not to discuss any of the terms of this deal with the seller. That is prefaced up front, and that's how I put together my owner-occupied showings. If I do have an owner-occupied property, though, I do want to get as many people involved with that initial showing as possible, so that way I'm limiting the amount of times that I have to bother that seller to get the deal done. I would like to try and cherry pick some of my best buyers to tour through first, so that way I know that I've got solid people I can work with. And then if I'm unable to secure the first showing, I'll go through a second showing where I just let almost anybody I can in, and I'll go through and then see if any of those people are willing to either partner with me to fund on the deal, or I can assign the contract directly to them. Okay? If it's a vacant property though, your limitations are eased up quite a bit. I mean, if it's vacant and you can get the seller to let you put a lockbox on there, I don't really think I've ever had a seller argue about putting a lockbox on a vacant property, because they don't want to have to drive out there and meet with me every time I want to show that property. But I'll go through and I'll work with that, and I'll get my buyers through the properties as needed as fast as I can. Prefer group showings. It's going to provide me the best opportunity for maximizing my time. But what happens if I'm struggling to get showings on this property? I only get 1 or 2 people hitting here or there. Well, then I'm gonna have to put forth the effort to go through each and every one of those and get them to show as fast as possible. But you know what? If I've got a lot of people interested, I'll do one single group showing and let it go through at that point in time. Another thing to look at is when we are doing the showings, you know, we're going to end up, well, let's say I do a mass showing and I've got 10, 15, 20 people showing up to all look at this house. You know, I personally prefer to say my price is my price. The first person that gives me a non-refundable check gets the property. That creates a little bit of a fire under these buyers. They see everybody else there, and I'm not trying to get them into a bidding war. I don't like that. You can. I've seen people do it successfully. I've done it on occasions. I personally, though, would much rather just stand there on the front porch and say, hey guys, I know a lot of y'all are interested. My price is my price. I'm not going to turn this into a bidding war, but I'm not going to sell it to anybody. I'm not going to hold any reservations until I get a $5,000 non-refundable check in my hand. And the first one of y'all that puts $5,000 non-refundable in my hand has the deal. I have found that on more occasions than not solidifies a contract right then and there, and I'm able to get the deal knocked out. Now, whenever I do start putting together silent auctions where I'm like, hey, give me your highest and best. Write it down on a piece of paper. We come in here. Whoever's got the highest and best gets the deal. I've done that on several occasions. It's not like a live auction where I just start auctioning it off. I'm just like, hey, like everybody here's got my phone number. Text me your highest and best right now. And whoever's got the highest and best right now is going to get the deal. I'm not going to go into a bidding war. Boom. I'll start seeing, because sometimes I'll put a market out, let's say for $80,000. And I'll start getting highest and best, and somebody offers me $88,000. It's like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. But the silent auction gets them to send me an offer of $88, where I was expecting everybody else was actually offering me like lower than what I was asking. That makes sense. Silent auctions can be good for you, but I do personally prefer not to, and I just do an incentive of whoever gets me that check first gets the deal. Okay. With those showings, your buyer's going to ask you a lot of questions. The more prepared you are for it, the better you're going to be. If you've got contractor bids and things like that lined out, I don't ever do that. I never do that outside of foundation. If there's a foundation bid, I get my foundation bid in. All of the rest of it, I leave solely up to my end buyer. I'll let them come through. I'll answer any questions they have as adequately as I can, but I'm not going to lie to them about anything. I'm going to try and disclose everything that I possibly know about that house, just so that way I turn this buyer into a repeat buyer. You start burning your buyers, they're not going to buy from you anymore. So make sure that you're doing a good job of keeping your buyers happy with what you're doing for them. Okay, qualifying the buyer. So I told you before, I'm standing on the front porch and it's like whoever gets me a check first can get it on this deal. Well, some of the things that I might ask while I'm dealing with this person, depending on how I'm going to close it, whether it be a double close or if it's a assignment of contract, I will ask them questions. And here's a kind of a verbatim script of what I would use with a new buyer that I've never worked with before. It's like, all right, so right now you've agreed to purchase this property from me for $80,000. You are aware that I am a wholesaler and I will be making a marketing fee off of the acquisition of this contract. Do you have a problem with that? And across the board, these people are going to say, no, I don't have a problem with you making money. And I was like, all right, well, you are good at buying this property at $80,000 right now. Does those numbers make sense to you? You want to buy this property for $80,000. Get them to say yes. Okay, now what if I told you I made $3,000 on this contract? Is that going to cause you a problem? Oh no, man, you make whatever you need to make. $3,000 is more than fair. You make your $3,000. You know what? These numbers are good for me. Good to go. All right, I'll then follow that question up with, all right, would you be okay if I was making $75,000 off of this property? Then kick back and pay close attention to how they handle that statement. If they start having objections to you making that much money, let's say their anticipated profit is going to be $20,000, and they say that you, the wholesaler, are making $75,000. Now I'm using an exaggerated number. Maybe I'd say 30, maybe I'd say 40. Make sure that I'm saying more than what I think they're going to make. I will ask them very point blank. It's like, would you be okay if I made more money on this deal than you? I'm not making $5,000. Let's say I'm making $40,000. And I want to see how they're going to handle that. Because if I start hearing them say, oh man, that's crazy, man. Well, 3,000 is fair, but if you're making 40, I'm only making 20. That right there is a very quick and clear indicator that this person is dealing with a scarcity mindset. They were okay with making $20,000 until they found out you made 40. That is not the type of buyer that you're going to want to do an assignment of contract with. Now, if you still feel comfortable that that buyer is solid, and we're going to need to qualify that in a second, then yeah, still contract with them. But instead of contracting with them with an assignment, because the assignment's going to disclose to that buyer how much money you made, and if you are making a little bit more than what you've disclosed up front, saying, what if I was making $3,000? Well, what if you were truly making $19,000? $19,000 might still be enough for that scarcity mindset to be upset with you. Okay, so I will double close and I'll paper them up with a double close. But prior to doing that, there's a few other things that I want to know about that buyer first. Is this the first time you've ever bought one of these types of properties? If it is, that's not a problem. You just need to make sure you do further due diligence. All right, this is or is not your first time. If this is not your first time, would you mind showing me some of your previous HUDs? And would you mind putting me in contact with your lender so I can verify your funds? What I don't want to do is go into contract with this person and let this person waste 2 weeks of my time to find out that they cannot perform. So I'll do a little bit of due diligence up front. I will still collect the $5,000 non-refundable and basically put something along the lines of, you know what, you've got about 1.5 hours to get me some copies of your HUD ones. I'd prefer it if you could show them to me on your phone right now. If you don't have copies of your HUDs in the next hour, then I'm taking to the next person. That person right there is next in line. And I'll let people know. It's like, all right, you're first in line, you're second in line. And I'll let people know that. That puts a fire underneath them, and that keeps them on the ball of knowing that they might still get this property. I'll try and stay in communication with both of them. All right, so I've got the first one. I now know if they're okay with me making money, and if they are, I'll do an assignment. If they're not okay with me making money, I'll do a double close. From doing the double close, I will also qualify that they have done deals in the past or have not done deals in the past. If they have, I want to see a copy of their HUDs. If they have not, I definitely want to talk with their lender. I'm going to want to talk to their lender no matter if they've done deals or not, but I'm going to call their lender up and say, hi, have you done deals with this person? Are we good to go moving forward? How fast can you close? What are you anticipating funding? When are you anticipating funding this? I'll ask all those questions up front before I go any further, okay? Collecting the deposit, there's 2 ways that this can be done. There's probably far more ways that I can think of, but there's 2 ways I'm going to discuss right now. The deposit, the non-refundable deposit, and I guess I should spend some little bit of time talking about the non-refundable deposit. I am going to either assign this contract or double close this contract. Let's say my anticipated profit is going to be $20,000. That's my anticipated profit on this deal. If I'm going to be making $20,000, that $20,000 that I make on my behalf has already been earned. I've done all of the necessary steps to put that into place. Now it is up to this buyer to get it to the finish line. I am putting a lot of faith in this buyer's ability to get it to the finish line, because if they do not, then I don't make the money that I've already earned. Okay? So I want this person to have some skin in the game up front, and that's going to be their non-refundable deposit. That non-refundable deposit is going to be paid to one of 2 people. It's either going to be paid directly to me, or it is going to be paid directly to the title company where I have opened my title. Okay? I personally prefer that deposit to go to me at all times. That prevents me from having any issues of getting the money released from escrow in the event that the buyer does not perform like they said they would. Okay? Now, collecting the deposit, I require it to be either a cashier's check or cash money. One of the two, and I keep a receipt book on me at all times. Remember in my toolbox we talked about earlier, I had a receipt of funds. I keep those receipts of funds with me at all times. I will then write a receipt of fund for the non-refundable deposit, and that will either go to myself or the title company. but I will have them give it to me directly. If it's a cashier's check, the cashier's check needs to be made out to the title company, but the deal is not theirs until I have it in my hand. Because you'll have somebody be like, yep, it's mine. I'm going to go to the bank right now. I'm going to get the cashier's check. And somewhere between leaving the front yard of that house and getting to the bank, their mouth did not keep up with their actions, and you lose the buyer. That's why I always say, I'm not holding it for anybody. And I try to prep my buyers before coming to an appointment. It's like, it's non-refundable if you have a cashier's check up front and or access to a cashier's check up front, or blah, 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 blah. If you want it right then and there, I want the money on the spot, and you start training your buyers to work with you on that level. But either way around, I need to collect the deposit. I need to give them a receipt for the deposit, and through the deposit, I'm going to need to contract this person. Now, how am I going to contract this buyer? That solely depends upon my exit strategy. If I am planning on using an assignment of contract, well, then I will sit down with the buyer and I will execute an assignment of contract. Now, a couple of other things to think about right here. If the buyer is buying your contract, the buyer is A, educated or hopefully educated enough to request to see the purchase contract. If I'm going to buy a contract for you and I'm agreeing to give you $5,000 upfront non-refundable, and I'm also agreeing to pay another $15,000 at closing, I want to see what I'm buying. I'm not buying the house from you. I'm buying the contract. I want to see what the terms of that contract are. Now, you as the assignor, remember employee, employer, that's going to be an easy thing for you to remember. The assignor is the person assigning the contract. The assignee is the person receiving the contract. And the easiest way for me to explain for you to remember that is the difference between employee and employer. Most people would rather be the employer than the employee. Well, when you're assigning contracts, you are in control. And if you are in control, you are the assignor. The person that is receiving the contract is the assignee. So I, as the assignor, am assigning this contract to them. I might not want them to see maybe what I had it under contract for. I might not want to have them see the owner's personal information, their contact information. I might black some of those things out on the contract, but I will still let that buyer see all of the rest of the terms, because that buyer is going to be obligated to the terms of the contract that you're selling them. Okay? Now, some of those terms might be changed in my assignment of contract, and that's what we're going to talk about right up next. But what if I do a double close with them? Okay, that's going to be a different type of paperwork. We're going to talk about that here in a second as well. But in a double close, I am not selling them my contract. In a double close, I am telling them that I am not the owner of title today, but I am in contract to take ownership of that property. And if I am able to take ownership of that property, I will then resell it to you. So then I put in together a sale agreement between the buyer and myself with some special addendums to cover the special circumstances of this transaction, and I will move forward and I'll execute a double close sale agreement. And I'll talk more about that here in just a second. Okay. So if I do move forward and I'm going to do an assignment of contract, some of the key things that I like to see in my assignment of contract, and I'm going to disclose here and I'm going to talk about over this slide, is the things that I want to see in my assignment of contract. One of them is we're going to need to define all of the parties involved. Who is the assignor? Who is the assignee? If the assignee is a company, who is the managing director or manager of that company, or who is in charge of writing checks for that company? And then I'll also have the seller written on there, but I won't put all their contact details in there. But I'm going to define all of the parties to this transaction. Okay? Now, non-refundable deposits. I need to have that very clearly defined in my contract. Yes, it is non-refundable, but surprisingly, that non-refundable deposit will be refunded in the event of certain things. Some of the things that will clearly justify returning of that money is if I am unable to get clear marketable title. Okay, I'm going to pause on that for just a moment, because there's over 500 talking points in this wholesale series, and there will be times I forget things. So here is one of the things that I forgot to put in here. Some wholesalers would prefer to figure out what the abstract of title looks like. Essentially, is my title good? Do I have bad things going on with title? Some wholesalers prefer to get all of those items addressed and taken care of prior to marketing the property for sale. And I can respect that. They verify they've got clean title and then they market it. I take a different approach. I've only got X amount of time on this contract to get it sold. I start marketing it immediately after submitting to title and opening chain of title. And while we're moving to close, I work on getting title cleared. About the time my title is clear, I should be on path to getting my buyer to close, and that gives me plenty of time to find out that if my buyer's not going to close, I can secure another buyer. Okay, I kind of went off trail there for a second, but the non-refundable deposit most definitely should be refunded in the event that you cannot give them the property. Okay, some other things that might warrant a refund of that deposit is if there is significant damage done to the home in the meantime. And why I say significant, I did have a buyer one time, and this is why I started putting this into my contract. The home in itself did not change in any significant manner, but somebody threw a baseball through the front window. Okay? The baseball caused maybe a couple $100 worth of damage, at best $300 to $400 worth of damage, at best. And the buyer tried backing out of the contract using that as their reason for backing out. They're like, man, when I contracted this, there was not a hole in that window. There's a hole in that window now, and I want my money back. Okay, well, I can respect them saying, you know what, give me $300 off the purchase price. Give me $500 off the purchase price. That I could have done. But somebody trying to get out of the contract for the simple fact that there's been a baseball thrown through a window, I don't consider that significant or warranting a full refund and letting them out of the contract. So I now address that in my assignment of contract. Other things, I need to define a close date with my buyer. Now let me give you some strong tips here. I'm going to contract with the seller, and let's say the seller has given me 30 business days to close, and we'll call that 45 days. I will not give my buyer of this contract the same 45 days. Remember earlier, that buyer's going to want to look at my contract. I would respectfully allow them to, because they're buying the contract. They want to see the terms that they're being held to. But what I will do is I'll use my assignment of contract to maintain control. And what I'll say is I'm going to give that person 10 days to close. I will speak with them up front. I was like, hey, can you get this deal closed in 7 days? Any respectful real estate investor that's been doing this for a while should definitely be able to get it done in 7 days. I will definitely say within 10, you've got to get something done there. Okay? So if I give them 10 days to close, I've got 45. Well, what happens at the end of the 10 days if this buyer does not perform? I will have it written into my assignment contract that I will have the option, I solely will have the option of extending their time to close on a per diem charge. Every day they fail to close, they owe me an additional $200 paid up front. And that $200 will be applied to their closing in the event they close. But in the event that they do not, I will retain those additional monies as damages for their tardiness in getting closed. I collect that up front. I normally collect 4 or 5 days up front. Like if they're like, I only need 2 more days, I'll be like, all right, give me 2 days up front. We'll move forward. If they're like, you know what, I'll have it done by the end of this week. I'll be like, well, you know what, I need another $1,000 today. Otherwise, we're going somewhere else. Now, okay, what happens if that person's like, I've already given you 5. I'm going to get this deal closed. Well, great. I'm glad you're going to get this deal closed, because when you put up that additional $1,000, that additional $1,000 is going to go towards your purchase price. And everything you're telling me right now is that you are 100% confident that you're closing, and therefore that $1,000 that you're going to apply to this closing is not going to affect you at all. And if you think that it is, then you still have a doubt in your ability to close. And if you're still doubting your ability to close, then guess what? I'm not extending the contract. If that $1,000 is causing you that much problem, we're not going to extend this contract. And that's protecting you, because remember, you've already done the work to make the 20 grand. You don't want to lose that. You don't want to lose that. So I will give that person a limited time to close, 10 days, at most 14. They should not need more than 2 weeks to get closed. At the event they fail to close by then, and I do not extend their time to close at all, the contract will revert back to me per my assignment. My assignment says if the time is of the essence, make sure that that is in there. Time is of the essence. All dates in this agreement are set in stone, blah, 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 not excusable. But in the event that this buyer does not perform by X date, the contract and purchase and sales agreement for XYZ property will automatically revert back to assignor as its sole and exclusive remedies, blah, 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 and they will retain the deposit. Okay, now if you're sitting here hearing all this and you're like, man, can I get a copy of your assignment contract? Guess what? Propelio is putting together Propelio Legal as we speak. Our attorneys are going through and checking out all of our documents, all of our paperwork, and getting them prepared to be offered to you guys. I don't want to just give you these contracts without having our attorneys knock them out first. So for those of you that are interested in it, make sure you drop your comments below because I'll start getting Propelio Legal to get all that paperwork over into you. So defining a closing date. Acknowledge communications. This is a key one, and this is what you learn after you've been in this business for a while. Your buyer is going to be compelled to talk to your seller, and you don't want that to happen because they start bitching and screaming over at the seller. The seller's like, who the hell is this bitching and screaming at me? And then all of a sudden your deal starts just winding down and going nowhere. I clearly define in my assignment contract that that buyer is under no circumstances, irregardless of their needs, to ever speak directly to that seller. All of their communication is to go directly to me. I will communicate their needs to the seller and I will relay it back to them, but at no point in time do they ever contact the seller directly. And if they do contact the seller directly, I have full and total right to retain their deposit, cancel their assignment of contract, and take the contract back. That is a complete and total breach of the agreement, and they are not to talk to the seller. I make sure I include that in my documents. Okay? Express equitable position. What do I mean by express equitable position? What are you selling? What are you selling? And I need to make sure you completely and totally understand this. You are not selling the property. You are selling the contract. I have equitable interest in a contract for 123 Main Street, and I am assigning my interest in that contract over to you in this assignment of contract. I need to make sure that they are clearly understanding that I am not selling them the property, I am selling them my contract. And they are unable to perform on that contract by fault of the seller or myself, I will refund their money. But if they fail to perform on this contract by a fault of their own, I will retain the money. Okay? Address access and repairs. You do not want your buyer going in there and just start working on this home before they own it. You don't want this buyer to just move into the house before they've even bought it. I know those sound like some excessive, wild swings of the imagination, but you definitely don't want your buyer in there demoing the house before it's closed. I say something as ridiculous as that is because it's happened. And you need to address these types of things in your contract. You don't want these people in these houses at 3 o'clock in the morning. I say that because it's happened before. So I need to tell them that their access to the property needs to be scheduled with me. Access with any of their contractors needs to be scheduled with me. I don't have to be there, but I need to know that they're gonna be there. And quite honestly, I would prefer to be there so that way that the property is being secured, it's being locked back up, and I know that the property is being respectful. Some key tips to think about is that if you have given the lockbox code out to anybody in the past, change it often. Change it often. That will eliminate looky-loos from coming back to the property after closing and gaining access to the property at any given point in time. Okay, performance clauses. We've mentioned them before. You are expected to achieve X, Y, and Z by X, Y, and Z dates. If you do not do that, then I do have the right to retain your deposits and revert the contract back to me as the assignor to further market and sell that contract. Performance clauses need to be in there. Disclosures and agreements. Disclosures such as you speak English, you're not drunk or high at the time, you understand that you're a real estate investor and you've done all of your own due diligence. You are not depending upon my due diligence. I am not representing you as a real estate agent. Blah, 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 blah. Disclosures and agreements are important to you. These are all things that we will include in the Propelio legal assignment contract and purchase agreements. Looking to put together a full package of documents for wholesalers. So if you have any interest in that at all, drop them in the comments below so that way I know how much effort I need to be putting into making these assets available to you. Pre-release earnest money deposit. Okay? I take non-refundable deposits up front. In the event that they're requiring to take this to title, it is still my non-refundable deposit, but guess where it's going? It's going to title. And title is not going to release those funds unless they can get both parties to agree to release it. One of the things that I will do is if I know that my non-refundable is going to title up front, I have already communicated with my title and I have a copy of their release form. I will get the seller at that time, or not the seller, I'll get the buyer, the assignee, to sign that release, and I'll get them to clearly state in there the full $5,000 is refundable to me in the event that they fail to close. And I'll get them to sign that before I ever do anything with it. Some people might want to argue about that. It's worked for me. That's why I do it. Address tenancy of the property. Is the property going to be transferred vacant? Will it be transferred tenant occupied? Will it be transferred owner occupied? Put a checklist in there, decide which one it's going to be transferred with, and then put in some of the additional clauses in there, like if it's going to be tenant occupied, the property will be tenant occupied. Please see Addendum A for a copy of the temporary lease. Please see Addendum A for a copy of XYZ. Okay, if it's going to be owner occupied, put a copy of the seller's temporary residential lease in there. Put all that in there. So that way it's very clearly defined up front what's going on with that property. Mineral rights is something else that I need to address while we're looking at this here. If you're doing a large volume of wholesaling and you're in an area and or you think you might be in an area that has minerals, then you do have the potential of, through the assignments of these contracts or the double close, to retain those mineral rights upon sale. Now that might not do much for you right now, but what happens if they do find that there are minerals underneath these properties? And now all of a sudden you have land and oil and gas people calling you up saying, hey, I'd like to do a mineral reservation for your property, or I'd like to do some land lease from you so I can get to the minerals underground. And now each one of these people are offering you $200 a month for access to drill under your home. Well, boom. Well, I own the rights to those. I don't own the home anymore, but I own the rights. I can now rent my rights out and collect revenue. So mineral rights might be something else you could look at. Okay, all of those things I include into my assignment of contract. This last slide that we're looking at here is going to be the double close contract. The double close contract is straight up a purchase and sales agreement. There's going to be some things that I'm going to want to define in there, and I use all of that in addendum. I still use my state promulgated purchase and sales agreement, but I'll put an additional thing in there that says see Addendum A. An Addendum A is 3 full pages of disclosures. I'm going to pull these up here for just a second. Let's go ahead and leave my computer off of the screen, but I'm going to pull one up for you real quick, and I'll pull up this addendum, and I'll show you what that looks like. Tuple soup. All right, let me see if I can get this pulled up on the screen for you. So we're still looking at that over there. All right, so I got that pulled up. I'll close this side over here. Zoom out just a little bit. All right, so I'll go ahead and let everybody take a look at this real quick. This is the addendum I use for my double close agreements. So I'll define the parties up front and the address of the property. I'll disclose that the property is as is, and that the buyer has done all of their own due diligence and they are taking no representations of my own. I will further continue through and address the down payment, that the property is a cash sale and there are no contingencies for financing, that I will go through closing cost reimbursement, that the end buyer will be responsible for any of my front end fees. So I talk about double closing, potentially having to have double the fees. I will disclose to this buyer up front that there will be additional fees that will be added on to theirs to not exceed maybe $1,500 or $1,000 or $2,000, but I need to disclose to them up front if they will be paying fees on my front side closing. I will disclose all of that right there. Any additional disclosures and acknowledgments, inspection report and subject property conditions, real estate brokerage disclosure saying I'm not representing anybody, marketable title acknowledgement. At the time of this agreement, seller owns a contract for sale and purchase of subject property. Buyer acknowledges that seller currently does not own title to subject property. This sale is contingent upon seller obtaining marketable title to subject property under seller's purchase contract. If seller is unable to obtain marketable title to subject property, then seller shall return buyer's down payment and this agreement is void with no further obligations between parties. That is an extremely important paragraph to have in a double closed contract. Property access, we talk about that. We go through here, we got lead-based paint disclosures. If the event that the title is delayed in coming to me, then we can extend this closing reasonably. Buyer and assignee has completed all physical inspections. Although buyer acknowledges that a failure to close will result in earnest money deposit, this is the per diem charge I was talking to you about. Notice of membership in a property owners association, does it or does it not? Seller/assignor reserves all existing mineral rights to the property. So remember I was talking to you about that. Now there might be some buyers that'll see that and they'll scream and yell and be like, no, I want the mineral rights. I'm not going to do anything with that. That's your opportunity right there to negotiate it. And in the event that they absolutely refuse to transfer without receiving the mineral rights, you might be able to get them to pay you a little bit more for the mineral rights, or you can choose right then and there to just say, you know what, let them have the mineral rights. But it's an opportunity for you to retain them. We'll keep them there. Okay, keep going through. Just the disclosure that Fannie Mae properties may have a 90-day limit on the resale of the property. Recording of deeds, making sure that they're aware that the recording of the deeds may not occur at the speed at which they're looking for. Service providers, any information obtained from me about, let's say the seller's like, hey, or not the seller, the buyer's like, hey, do you know any good electricians that can do X, Y, and Z for me? And I give them a referral for it. Well, you know what? You're not basing any of your decisions upon the referral that I've given you. Ability to understand, basically saying I'm not drunk or high, that I speak English, and that I have the rights to contract an attorney in the event that I'm not comfortable with this transaction. It's the entire agreement, and I get them to sign. That's what I use on a double close transaction. So what's a double close transaction look like? It looks just like a regular purchase agreement. I use that addendum in there. And how is this double close going to function? How are we going to perform on the closing? All right. I have to buy the property from the seller. That's the only way I can truly sell it to the buyer. Okay, so let's talk about scheduling the buyers and scheduling the sellers. So that way I don't end up in a situation where I have bought a property and my buyer backs out. Now, prior to 2009-ish, Dodd-Frank, or I believe it was Dodd-Frank, don't let me misquote you on that, but I'm pretty sure it was Dodd-Frank that made a little bit of changes. No, I think it was RESPA. Either way, it doesn't matter. I think it was truly RESPA laws, but it doesn't really matter. The closing procedures for a title company prior to 2009-ish, I could go in there and do what I would call a dry funding. Okay, now let me explain to you what I mean by a dry funding so you can understand that premise before I build upon that. Dry funding is if I've got the seller to agree to sell me the property for $70,000. I've got the buyer to agree to pay $75,000 for it. Well, if the buyer is bringing $75,000 to close with me, couldn't I just use $70,000 of that and just hand it to the seller and say we're done? You get what I'm saying? It's like he hands me 75, I take 70 of it and hand it to her, to the seller. Does that make sense? That's what we would call a dry fund. I brought none of my own money to the table. The money that was brought to the table was brought by the buyer, and the buyer's funds were used to pay the seller, and I kind of moved in the middle. That used to happen very often prior to 2009. There are still a few title companies that will allow that to happen as long as your end buyer signs all of the proper disclosures to notify them that their funds are actually being used to fund my transaction. And some titles companies will still allow you to do that. But in the event you are not able to dry fund this transaction, and with you being a newer real estate investor, maybe not having much experience, your title company may not allow you to do that. They may not. But in the event you're allowed to do that, great. You don't need to bring any funds to the table. The buyer's funds are used to pay off the seller, and that's how we move forward. But what if I have to use transactional funding? Transactional funding being a hard money lender or somebody like that that'll allow you to borrow the money for 24 to 72 hours, and you pay a fee for doing so. Okay? Well, what happens if I get that transactional funding into the title company, and then I buy it from the seller, and I'm sitting there waiting for the buyer to come in, and the buyer never shows up? That could be really scary for you because you know the money used to just buy this was only good for 24 to 72 hours, and your buyer that was supposed to show up never showed up. Well, let me tell you how you're supposed to handle this. You schedule your seller for in the morning, and you get your seller to come in and you get them to sign off on all of their paperwork. Then You get the buyer to come in midday and sign all of their paperwork. Now you have all of the documents required to transfer title signed by the seller, all the documents required to transfer title signed by the buyer. I will then schedule myself for the end of the day, and I'll execute all of the paperwork with the seller, transferring title to me, and then I will simultaneously execute all the paperwork to sell it to the buyer, and I will then transfer title to the buyer. I will own that house for every bit of about 15 seconds. But it's that 15 seconds that does put me on the chain of title long enough that I incorporate a few additional liabilities to that home. Now that I was the owner to the seller or to the buyer could have some potential recourse against me. I'm not saying that to scare you. It just opens up some opportunities for things to change. That is how a double close works. I schedule the seller in the morning. I schedule the buyer in the mid-afternoon. I schedule myself at the end of the day. I sign off on all of it. I make sure that his funds are in closing. And if his funds are in, transactional funds get released, his funds get paid back, and the deal's done. That is how we make that work. That's how a double close transaction works. So if I have failed to teach you something in this dispositions course, my apologies. Please ask your questions below, and if you hit some questions that I have failed to address in this series, I'll come back and shoot some addendums to it. But everything I've done so far should have taught you from the disposition frontwards to backwards, and I look forward to seeing your comments below. For those of you that are not familiar with Propelio.com, Propelio.com is a software company that provides software tools to real estate investors. So if you're out there using your Gmail or your Yahoo email address and you're wanting to establish a little more credibility as a business, you don't need any tech experience at all. Just go to Propelio.com, and in less than 5 minutes, I can get you a custom email address. I can get you a lead generating website for your business, access to nationwide lead lists, access to nationwide MLS comps, access to a driving for dollars feature that is incredible. Some of the features that we're releasing on that are just beyond revolutionary. So if you have not tried out Propelio.com yet, please go out there, give us a try. We have a 7-day credit cardless free trial, no credit card required. Go out there, sign up, see what the tools are that we can provide you. And if they help you out in this wholesaling business, make sure you come back in here and drop us a note and say thank you. So look forward to seeing you on the next class.